Let's paint a picture. It's Friday night. Your friend group is doing the classic, "What should we watch?" debate, which somehow always takes 45 minutes and ends in resentment. Someone suggests a feel-good romantic comedy. Someone else floats a nature documentary. And then there's you, the one quietly, patiently waiting, who suggests The Shining and watches half the group physically recoil like you just proposed eating dinner in a cemetery. And yet, you've seen The Shining 11 times. You notice something new on the 11th watch. You were not scared. You were engaged. Society has a word for people like you. Several words, actually. Morbid, disturbed, a lot. But here's the thing that psychology's been quietly figuring out for the last 2 decades, and what nobody in that friend group debate knows. Your brain isn't broken. It's running a program everyone else forgot to install. Here's the psychological twist nobody sees coming. The people who are most obsessed with horror, who can sit through the chest-bursting scene in Alien without flinching, who have strong opinions about which Blumhouse film is actually underrated, who own a Funko Pop of Pennywise from It. These people are often operating with a more finely tuned emotional regulation system than the folks who refused to finish Get Out at a dinner party because it was too intense. That's not an insult to anyone who prefers lighter content. It's just what the research suggests. And by the end of this video, I'm going to explain a specific psychological concept called the controlled threat response, the built-in mental mechanism that horror lovers are quietly using to train their nervous system, and why that might be one of the most underrated emotional skills a person can have. Stay with me, because this one is going to change how you see every horror fan you've ever known. Let's start with what's actually happening in your brain when you press play on something frightening. The moment a horror film gets going, the second the score shifts, the lighting changes, and something moves in a corner that definitely should not be moving, a small, almond-shaped structure deep in your brain called the amygdala lights up like a switchboard. The amygdala is your brain's threat detection center, and it is deeply, fundamentally unsophisticated. It does not know you are on a couch. It does not care that you've seen this movie before. The second it registers a threat, real or fictional, it starts sending emergency signals throughout your entire body. Cortisol rises, heart rate goes up, pupils dilate. Your hands might grip the blanket slightly harder. This is a full physiological fear response, and it is happening to you while you watch the original Exorcist, the 1973 film that reportedly caused audience members to faint and vomit in theaters during its initial release. Priests were said to have been called to some screenings. That is the level of biological reaction we are talking about. But here is where horror fans diverge from the rest of the population in a genuinely fascinating way. A study published in the journal Motivation and Emotion found that horror fans didn't just experience fear during scary content, they also recovered from it significantly faster than non-fans. Their nervous systems bounced back to baseline more efficiently. The fear was just as real. The recovery was more skilled. What that tells researchers is that consistent horror viewing trains something called top-down emotional regulation, a communication pathway between your rational prefrontal cortex and your reactive amygdala. Every time you sit through something genuinely frightening and come out the other side fine, your brain quietly files that away as evidence. Fear is survivable. Fear ends. I can handle this. And that filing system, it turns out, has applications well outside of movie night. Now, before we go further, I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it. What was the first horror movie or show that genuinely messed with you? Not just a jump scare that made you spill your drink, but something that actually stayed with you. Something that crept into your thoughts the next morning while you were making coffee and you had to shake it off. Drop it in the comments. I'm asking because there's a pattern researchers have started noticing in what they call the entry point experience for horror fans. And I'm genuinely curious whether it shows up here too. For me, it wasn't the gore. It wasn't the monsters. It was the 1991 film, The Silence of the Lambs. Specifically, the quiet, almost polite way Hannibal Lecter spoke. The horror wasn't loud, it was precise. And something about that precision was more unsettling than anything I'd seen before. That was the moment the genre stopped being just scary movies and became something I needed to understand. Okay, here's where things get even more interesting and a little bit surprising. Psychologist Michael Apter, working in the 1980s on a framework called reversal theory, identified a concept he called the protective frame. The idea is this: humans are capable of experiencing intense emotions at full volume when they feel genuinely safe from the real consequences of those emotions. Think about standing on the edge of an actual cliff. That's terrifying. Now think about watching footage of someone else standing on the edge of that same cliff. Thrilling, maybe. The emotional content is similar. The danger is zero. Horror operates entirely within this framework. Your amygdala generates a real fear response, genuine physiological stress. But because you are on a couch, because the screen is a contained world with a beginning and an end, your brain can process that fear without having to do anything about it. It's one of the only places in modern life where you can feel something at full intensity with absolutely no consequences. And this, researchers believe, is exactly why horror is disproportionately attractive to people who grew up in unpredictable environments. If your childhood home had an emotional climate that could shift without warning, if you learned early how to read a room the moment you walked through the door, how to gauge someone's mood from the sound of their footsteps on the stairs, then horror offers something real life often couldn't. A fear that has an ending, a tension that resolves, a monster that, by the final act, gets identified, confronted, and dealt with. There is a reason Hereditary hits differently for some people than for others, and it has nothing to do with their tolerance for disturbing content. It has everything to do with what their nervous system already knows about living inside a story that doesn't make sense. Let's talk about something the research calls need for cognition, because this is the part that tends to genuinely surprise people. A 2020 study out of the University of Chicago found that horror fans scored significantly higher on this measure, which tracks how much a person enjoys effortful, analytical thinking. What that means in practice is that horror fans aren't passive viewers. They're not just sitting there absorbing the imagery. They're actively analyzing it, tracking character motivations, noticing foreshadowing, clocking the moment where something went wrong, and asking why. This is the person in your friend group who paused Midsommar and said, "Wait, that symbol appeared in the opening scene." This is the person who can explain the entire thematic architecture of Hereditary's ending, but also warned you not to eat before watching it. These aren't people with a dark streak. These are people with extremely active pattern recognition systems who happen to have found one of the most complex narrative playgrounds available to us. Cognitive psychologists describe this as parasocial threat processing. When you follow a character through genuine danger, you're not just watching. You're running mental simulations. What would I do? What did she miss? How did something this ordinary become this catastrophic? And those simulations, practiced over years of horror viewership, build a very real skill: the ability to spot the early warning signs of a situation going sideways before anyone else has noticed. Horror fans tend to be better at identifying inconsistencies in behavior, reading a room, and recognizing when something doesn't quite add up. Not because they're paranoid, but because they've spent years studying human behavior under the most extreme possible conditions. Now look, I'm not here to pretend that everyone who loves horror is processing it perfectly. That would not be honest, and you deserve the honest version. For some people, horror can function as a form of avoidance, a way to feel intense emotion without having to sit with where that emotion is actually coming from. If the only time you feel genuinely present is when something frightening is on the screen, that's worth paying attention to. Not because horror caused it, but because it might be pointing at something underneath that could use some air. And researchers have noted that binge-watching horror at 2 a.m. when you're already exhausted and anxious is a different experience than watching it from a regulated, rested place. The calibration only works when your nervous system has room to recover. The fear, the resolution, the return to calm, all three parts of that cycle matter. Skip the last part consistently, and you're not training resilience. You're just feeding the hypervigilance. But for the person who watches horror because they are genuinely compelled by it, who finds something clarifying rather than destabilizing in the experience, who comes out of a scary movie feeling oddly settled rather than wrecked, the research is on your side. Here's what it all adds up to. Your love of horror isn't a personality flaw that you've learned to justify. It's not a coping mechanism dressed up as a hobby. According to the actual science, it is a sophisticated engagement with one of the most emotionally complex art forms available to us. One that happens to also train emotional regulation, pattern recognition, analytical thinking, and the very specific psychological skill of sitting inside discomfort long enough to understand it. The Exorcist didn't make you weird. The Haunting of Hill House didn't break you. Watching Rosemary's Baby alone in your apartment at midnight didn't mean something was wrong with you. If anything, the research suggests it meant the opposite. You are someone whose brain learned, through years of voluntary exposure to fictional fear, that hard things can be survived, that dark stories still end, that even the most unsettling situations, once you understand them, lose their power over you. That is not morbidity. That is emotional courage dressed in a very specific aesthetic. So the next time someone wrinkles their nose at your watch list and asks, "How do you watch that stuff?" you can smile and tell them, it's just a routine calibration of your central nervous system. Or you can just say you like the plot. Either works. If any part of this resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in the protective frame, in the pattern recognition, in the idea that horror has always been about understanding rather than fear, I want you to type the word fearless in the comments, because that's what this actually is.